Before Air Florida, fire departments, police departments in the Washington area and well beyond operated somewhat in silos. They were independent of each other. They didn't necessarily communicate with each other well. They didn't plan well together. They didn't execute well together. Air Florida changed that. In 30 minutes, that was a change, a quantum change in the way in which things happen. Now, that change did not occur in 30 minutes, but in 30 minutes' time, it laid the foundation for that change to occur over the next 10 years.
You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations.
And when we started rolling, I think the very first shot on my video is someone being loaded as a gurney with someone on it being loaded into the ambulance. And it must have been a man because he had large shoes. I came to learn later that was Bert Hamilton, was the first survivor out of the water, and he lived in Rockville. And I later learned also when I met his wife, probably weeks or months later, that she knew he was all right because she recognized his shoes. He was a big guy and he had like large size 13 shoes. And when she saw his shoes sticking out in the gurney, she said, all right, at least he's out of the water. So that was one of those, remarkable stories you hear after the fact. Roger Oling was driving his pickup truck and he was stuck in traffic on the 14th Street Bridge going into Virginia. And he worked at St. Elizabeth's in Southeast Washington. And I believe he saw the plane crash into the water and just left his truck on the bridge and ran down off of the bridge, down the embankment to the shoreline. And I guess other people like him had stopped and they figured, well, they could see the survivors out in the water. And apparently, according to Roger, they tied ropes, battery cables, anything they had in the trunks of the car, they tied together. Roger tied it around his waist and jumped in the water and tried swimming out to the survivors. And he got pretty close to them, close enough that they were able to shout to each other. And I think at one point, I just recently read, he went back to the shoreline so they could lengthen the rope, went back towards the survivors. It was just amazing because we're talking freezing water now. I mean, the Potomac was frozen over. And again, he got near the survivors, but he told us later that he felt he was fading because he was in the cold water. He was wearing all his clothes. He was getting weighted down, and it was taking its toll on him. And then the helicopter showed up. And when Don and Gene showed up in Eagle One, they pulled Roger back to the shore. It was amazing. My hat's off to those guys. I mean, they went above and beyond, and they risked their lives doing that. And again, they used the helicopter in a way it was never designed to fly and maneuver. At one point, Don had the helicopter skids in the water with Gene standing on the skids, pulling Nikki Felch, the last survivor out of the water, pulling her up out of the water onto the skids and basically holding on to her by the scruff of the neck. And she was the last one and probably in a really bad way. And it's just like, let's just get you out of the water. Those guys did an amazing job. And a lot of credit to them. I remarked to Don when I met him at the hangar years ago when Eagle One was being restored in the Park Police hangar. It was on display, and Don and I were there. We were chatting, and I admitted to him that at one point during the rescue, I believe it was when they had Nikki Felch on the skids of the helicopter, so she was the last one out of the water. To get her off the helicopter, off the skids, Don had to come down pretty low, and the shoreline was probably about 7 feet above the actual water. And the helicopter is going further and further down towards the water, and people are on the shoreline. And the lower he went towards the water, the blades were coming down lower. And if you look closely at the tape, when they're trying to get Nikki off the skids, I start backing up because I was convinced my soundman and I were going to be killed, that the helicopter blades are just going to cut us into little pieces. And that would be the end of it. And I remember remarking to myself, thinking, this could be the end. And I hope this tape survives. And nothing happened. And when I mentioned it to Don, he smiled. He said, I saw you guys. He said, I knew it was close, but I saw you guys. I said, well, I'm glad you saw us, because I was really concerned.
One of the things that it did was to allow for a new level of collaboration, cooperation, coordination between various public safety entities that didn't exist before. Before Air Florida, fire departments, police departments in the Washington area and well beyond operated somewhat in silos. They were independent of each other. They didn't necessarily communicate with each other well. They didn't plan well together. They didn't execute well together. Air Florida changed that. In 30 minutes, that was a change, a quantum change in the way in which things happen. Now, that change did not occur in 30 minutes, but in 30 minutes' time, it laid the foundation for that change to occur over the next 10 years. Well, the greatest tribute to the souls that lost their lives that day was the fact that it evoked a lot of change, positive change to save many, many other lives in the years to follow. So at least their lives being lost was not lives lost in vain.
About 2 years later, maybe a year and a half, I'm in my office and the secretary buzzes me and tells me that Gene Windsor, who was the paramedic, was out and had two individuals with him, a lady and family, and would I be able to see them? Well, I thought it was Gene's parents probably had come to visit him. Well, naturally, I was going to see him and greet him and say hi and how much we thought of Gene and what he had done. And to my surprise, I'm sitting at my desk, and on the right hand behind me is the American flag, and on the left hand behind me is the Park Police flag. And so this man and woman came in, and two little boys, looked like twins. They couldn't have been, I'd say about 18 months old or something like that. And the lady stepped forward to shake my hand. She says, Chief Herring, I'm the stewardess that was on Air Florida 90. And she says, I have two purposes. Number one, I wanted to meet you personally and thank you for the tough decision you had to make. And I'm very grateful to God that you made that decision. And she said, this is my husband. And I said hello to him too. And she says, these two little blonde-headed twin boys here would not be here today if I hadn't been saved from that Air Florida 90 crash. So she says, later result that happened since the Air Florida crash. Well, you know, I'm supposed to be the big chief and all, but I tell you, I got very emotional and tears. I saw those two kids and tears just came down my cheeks. And I've said softly to myself, thank you, God, for helping me make that decision.
I think the big lesson of that day is that people are generally good at heart. They want to help. When decent people see others in distress, they stop what they're doing and try to help. And that's what the civilians on the shoreline did. That's what Roger Olean did. That's what Lenny Skutnik did when he jumped in the water and saved Priscilla Tirado, who was about to drown. The helicopter crew, Don and Gene, you know, they didn't have to fly, but that's their job. And they knew there's risk in their jobs. And they chose to jump in and help because they're good people. George and I were on the shoreline. And at one point, I remember thinking to myself, when Priscilla Tirado was about to drown before Lenny saved her, I thought, this is not right. This woman is drowning in front of my camera. I need to put the camera down and do something. And I have no idea what I would have done, but it just seemed so unfair that I'm videotaping her, which is my job and is not always pleasant. And when I looked around at one point, I kept on rolling, but I think I took my eye out of the viewfinder, and I kind of looked around, and it snapped me back to reality that there were people there, good people, doing what they could to help. So I thought, okay, just, keep your wits about you, don't screw up, and just keep rolling. But I think the big lesson is people are generally good and they want to help.
To this day, I will tell you that any of the crews that would have been there would have gone out, and maybe it would have looked different, but in the end, everything would have still come out the same. They would have gone out, they would have battered their brains trying to figure out how to do things. They would have probably come to most of the same conclusions we did, done the same work, and it would have just been a Park Police helicopter with two guys in blue flight suits out there working their butts off, trying to get the job done.
Like I said, it was indeed a day for the ages. In fact, when you visit the museum, you can see some of the footage that Chester Panzer recorded standing in the snow that day. One of the responsibilities and opportunities of a museum like ours is to tell stories like these, to preserve and present artifacts that help us better understand what's come before and, as a result, who we are today. One of my favorite artifacts in the National Law Enforcement Museum is Eagle One, which you can see behind me. We just heard amazing stories of this very helicopter, and in the museum, we can see this piece of history for ourselves. Let's learn even more about this famous helicopter from one of the people responsible for bringing it to our museum, Russ Matthews.
I was 13 years old when the Air Florida crash happened. And I can remember that. I can remember seeing it on the news. I can remember the emotion of that, of seeing that horrible crash and the aftermath of it, and also just the exhilaration of the image of Lenny Skutnik jumping into the water to save Priscilla Tirado, and watching that whole scene unfold. In the days before everyone was carrying a video camera with them, to actually watch history unfold was very unusual. And that footage that Chester Panzer captured is so powerful. And about actually 15 years ago, so 2007, I saw a documentary about the Air Florida crash on the Weather Channel, of all things, and it included that footage. And from that perspective, watching it, I was still riveted. Your heart is in your throat, like watching this and watching, that helicopter, and the way that Don Usher, was flying it that day. You can see, especially there's the moments when it approaches the riverbank, and you can see just how close the rotors are coming to that slope and how expertly he's maneuvering it. And then just that heart-stopping moment when the landing skids actually go underwater, when they pull the last survivor out of the water. It is a moment when the skill and the courage and the technology kind of all came together, and it made all the difference in the world for 5 people. And so I remember seeing that doc again, watching that footage, and the thought comes into my mind, could that helicopter still exist? Could it still be out there somewhere? And things tend to hang around in general aviation for a long time. So I thought, well, there's a chance. And I brought it up to some other people, some other friends of mine that are also interested in historic preservation. A guy named Art Rapinski knew a lot more about Googling than I did in those days. I I'm not even sure it was Google then. It might have been, Bing or Ask Jeeves. I don't know how he did it, but he found an article that talked about this historic helicopter that had been used in the rescue. Eagle One had now moved out and was now serving out in the West with the Bureau of Reclamation. So it still was out there, still soldiering on. So this helicopter had just been transferred out there and was now, keeping track of water levels in the Pacific Northwest and the lower Colorado River region. So it was part of the year in Flagstaff and part of the year at Boise, Idaho. And as it turns out, my family, we spend some time in the summers in Boise, Idaho. So I reached out. There was a friend of mine who's an archaeologist who does a lot of work with the National Park Service, which is also part of the Department of Interior. So he was able to connect me with the people out in Boise who, managed the helicopter. And I got in contact with them and asked, could I come and see it? And they were totally agreeable. And so I went out to a hangar in Boise, Idaho, August 1st, 2007. It was my mom's birthday. And, they took me into the hangar and there it was. And you would never have known to look at it that this was Eagle One. It was, they'd repainted it in the meantime. It was in this very nondescript kind of white, red, and gold trim paint scheme. And they'd changed the call sign, so it was N613 now. But the people at the Bureau of Reclamation knew what they had. So the regional pilot was the one who took me to look at the helicopter, and I remember him taking me over to the left side door, and the latch that you use to open it gets a lot of use. So the latch had been the paint had been scuffed off the top edge, and underneath you could see the blue paint. So you knew this is Eagle One. This is the one right here. So in this, hangar in Boise, Idaho. And for me, I'd spent a lot of time at that point on expeditions in the South Pacific and, just kind of remote areas of the woods in Maine and Newfoundland looking for lost aircraft. And I'd also been involved with, some efforts to preserve some historic ships. And the thing is, a lot of times those kinds of projects, you are called to action because either, the ship or the plane is on its way to the junkyard, or it's been on the bottom of the ocean for the last 80 years. And so this was a time where the idea was, well, can we get ahead of the curve? Can we find this thing out there still serving on, and then arrange that when it finally ends its service life, that you can arrange just a smooth transition into an honorable retirement. And it was what actually the friend of mine that had connected me with the Park Service, he termed it preventative archaeology. So so that was the thought is, can we find someplace, that'll be ready to accept this when it's done its service. So Eagle One back there it's a Bell 206 Long Ranger. And it's a great design. It's been manufactured for decades. As an object, as an aviation artifact, it's unremarkable. What makes it special is what was done with it, what the crew did when it really mattered. And so I got to thinking, well, if its place isn't in aviation history, where is it? And it said, well, then I thought, what about police history? So I called another friend. This one was a retired police captain in my hometown in Princeton, New Jersey, a guy named Mario Musso. And I asked him, is there a National Police Museum? And at the time, again, this is 15 years ago, he said, well, no, but they're building one. And I was, oh, that's interesting. So by this time, I'd learned to do a little bit of Googling for myself and discovered that, the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial was going to develop a National Law Enforcement Officers Museum in D.C. And it's like, are you kidding me? That's only a few miles from the spot where, this helicopter had made history. So I reached out, online. I contacted a woman by the name of Lori Beatty and brought it to her attention that this was still out there, and this object that had, such an incredible place in police history, was still out there and still available. And could we put in the process, put in the mechanisms that would see it preserved. So that was, I guess, sort of the first domino to fall, and there was a lot more to go from there. That's my personal perspective. I know that a lot of people and a lot of organizations had to come together, to make things happen, from that point on. And I remember getting an email with an attachment, and it had a rendering that showed Eagle One suspended from the ceiling in the main atrium. Like it basically, it would be the first thing you see when you walk into the museum, and I couldn't think of a better spot for it. I just, from that moment of, could it still be out there, and is there a way to save it? I don't even think at that time I imagined a better, more fitting spot than where it is actually right now, right behind me. One of the things I really like about this is that I feel like Eagle One is about the purest expression of what it really means to be a peace officer, to put your life on the line for others, for people you've never met. And that's what Don Usher and Gene Windsor did that day. You watch the tape, and it strikes you actually the same way that it struck one of the survivors. He talked about, he was in the water, that freezing water, and looking around and realizing, I just survived a plane crash, and now I'm going to die with 1,000 people looking on. Because he was in the middle of this frozen river, terrible injuries, blinded by jet fuel, with basically freezing to death with seemingly no hope at all. And then, here's the sound of rotor blades of the chopper, coming through the storm to the rescue. And yeah, it's really something to put yourself in that place. And it was something that hit me when they first raised the helicopter to the ceiling, was that when it got above my head, I'd never seen it from below before. You saw the detail of the helicopter, but you realized, that was the first sight that the people in the water had of this coming for them. And to be there in that spot, and to be able to view the videotape and put yourself in that spot is remarkable. And that's what these objects do. They are touchstones to the past. The stuff that was there then that is still here now. And it takes very little imagination to stand in their presence and put yourself back in those stories and in that experience. And it's something that these objects will speak, when the people who were part of it no longer can, and will speak to generations to come and inspire them for what's possible and what we can be for each other. So.
We've now heard about January 13th, 1982. We've taken to the air to see the route and to glimpse a rare view of Washington, D.C. And we've learned about the journey for Eagle One to land in our museum. 40 years ago, the primary tools used during the rescue were a tow rope and a simple ring like this, called a throw buoy, not even intended to fit a person. Now, this isn't the actual ring they used back then, but it was given to the museum by the U.S. Park Police and makes shockingly real the lack of specialized equipment at their disposal. So, what about today? What does the aviation look like for the U.S. Park Police now, 40 years on from the rescue? For our concluding segment, we're heading to the Eagle's Nest, the aviation hangar for the U.S. Park Police. There we'll get a tour of the current Eagle One to see how it's different from this helicopter from 1982, and we'll speak with Acting Commander of the Aviation Section, Sergeant Timothy P. Ryan, to better understand how the section's work has changed in the 40 years since the rescue.
My name is Sergeant Timothy Ryan. I'm the Acting Commander of the United States Park Police Aviation Unit. So our primary focus is to provide support for the United States Park Police. That incorporates law enforcement, so searches, surveillance, that kind of stuff. We do medevacs here in the District of Columbia and also in the state of Maryland and Virginia. We do search and rescue primarily in Great Falls and out in Shenandoah, as well as urban search and rescue as well. And we also do presidential and foreign dignitary protection. So anytime the president moves in the area, we provide reconnaissance to make sure the route is safe for him. We actually go pretty far out. So we've gone as far as New Orleans to support operations in support of Hurricane Katrina, and also up to New York to support Superstorm Sandy, the operations up there as well. So our typical service areas in the Washington metropolitan area, that includes Maryland and Virginia as well. We can go up to 50 statute miles from the White House on our own, just to respond to whatever need there is. If we want to go a little bit further than that, like out to Shenandoah or Western Maryland, we just need to get permission from the shift commander.
Tell us about how your work today is influenced by what happened with the Air Florida rescue 40 years ago.
A lot of the operations that we do right now can be traced directly back to the mission that they flew on that day. Civilian helicopters weren't typically used in search and rescue operations, certainly not in rescue operations back then. They opened the door for people to look at us in a different light. Instead of just being an eye in the sky, people realized that the helicopter could be used in different applications. So it really opened the door for us to do search and rescue operations, hoist operations, and medevacs. That really sort of opened the door and paved the way for us. Helicopters really weren't used in that application back then. There's an anecdotal story, I can only assume that it's true, that during a static display where we take the helicopter out and talk to people and explain what we do, Don had been asked the question just a couple weeks prior to that whether or not we did river rescues. And his response was, no, we don't do that. That's just TV stuff. But it sort of speaks to the ethos that they had, and we think still kind of governs what we do here, that our mission is our mission, but as things come along, we try to adapt to accomplish whatever mission comes our way. So sort of the most high profile things that we've been involved in, clearly Air Florida is sort of the one that everybody thinks about. We also played a significant role in the response to the Pentagon on 9/11. And we also were involved heavily with evacuations and rescues over at the Washington Navy Yard. We also did medevacs at the congressional baseball team shooting. So we've been involved in a lot of high profile things. But honestly, the ones that stick with me the most, the ones that I think about, are the rescues that we do on the river or up in Shenandoah or in other places as well, where we're just, it's an isolated individual rescue where you get somebody back up board and they look at you and they realize that you've sort of gotten them out of a bad position. And that's really sort of what drives us to do what we do here. The biggest thing that we want people to understand is that we're here to help. We are a law enforcement agency. Our job is law enforcement. That's what we're here to support. But we train extensively to get into this job, and we train on an ongoing basis to be able to perform additional tasks. So medevacs, search and rescues, hoist rescues, all that kind of stuff. We're a law enforcement agency, but we also have important components that sort of support that mission in a way that people might not be familiar with and might not recognize.
Thank you to all those who participated in this program and for sharing your stories. Eagle One, always watching over us at the museum, is a reminder of what's best in the story of American law enforcement. It helps us consider the ways law enforcement serves creatively, responds to new challenges, overcomes adversity, and ultimately seeks to save lives. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to visit our website, where you'll find an online exhibit that offers a broader look at law enforcement aviation and airborne public safety. We owe a debt of gratitude to Roger Connor, curator of vertical flight at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, for guest curating this online exhibit. Thanks again to Russ Matthews for your continued support of this program and of our new online exhibit, and a very special thanks to the United States Park Police for your efforts in helping make today's program possible. And of course, thanks to all of you for joining us today. You can find more content from the museum on our website and social media channels. And when you're in Washington, D.C., please visit us in person and see Eagle One for yourself. Farewell, and thank you to all of the law enforcement officers out there. Be safe.
We hope you learned something from this episode and will join us next time for another edition of Encore, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. A special thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of Encore, a series from the Precinct 444 podcast network by the National Law Enforcement Museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.